You're listening to Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, a podcast offered in partnership with Missio Alliance. Each episode, we discuss internal and relational pressures, how they block effective leadership, and how we can move through them to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
Friends, today I'm excited to welcome my guest, Dave Ferguson. Dave is the founding and lead pastor of Community Christian Church in Naperville, Illinois. Dave was on the cutting edge, one of the first adopters of scattered site, campus-based churches. He's also the founder of the NewThing Network, which is probably the most robust church planting network actually in the world. And Dave's also one of the founders of the Exponential Conference, which started out primarily as a church planting conference. I'd say now it's really a conference for any faith leaders, but it really focuses on church planting. I've known about Dave for a long time, I think probably 15 years now, but I don't know Dave. We met actually on this podcast, but I've got several friends who know Dave well, and they would simply say that he's just one of those guys who's really unpretentious, really sharp. He has big dreams, and then he seems to be the least surprised when they actually happen. I wanted to get Dave on the show because I'm fascinated by entrepreneurial leaders who not only had the ability to cast vision, but had the ability to build healthy organizations. And I think that's Dave. And you're going to hear some real nuggets from Dave. I just started by asking him, when did he first notice that he was an entrepreneurial leader? So Dave, where I want to begin is, I think anyone who knows you or knows of you would describe you as an entrepreneurial leader. Your ability to see something that's missing, cast vision for it, and then build it into like what I would consider at least like a healthy organization or a sustaining thing. It's pretty remarkable. Could you just talk to us about when you first started to notice that you had entrepreneurial gifts?
I don't know if I noticed it or not, but like even when, like my brother John and I, we actually started Community Christian Church, the same church that we lead today. But even when we were kids, I can remember, I think I was probably like 10 years old. He's probably 8. And we started our own lawn service business in the neighborhood. So, I mean, it was kind of like, there was something that was kind of like, oh, well, why not just start it? And then later on, when I was in college, I really, and we can get into this if you want, I really didn't like the idea of being a pastor, but I did feel very compelled by, as the way I word it now, to help people find their way back to God. And the more I pursued like the best way to help people find their way back to God, it kind of was like, ooh, that happens through the church. But I don't know exactly why, but I just intuitively kind of knew like, oh my goodness, if I was going to work in a church, an existing one may not tolerate me and what I want. I should just start one. So I think even as a kid and then definitely as a young adult, it was just like, it was kind of like just, I was just drawn to it, which I think probably flows out of gifting and passion.
Yeah. And you and John started Community in 1989, right?
Yeah. It's over 30 years now.
Yeah. So you didn't have a whole lot of models for entrepreneurial pastoral leadership back then. How did you find your way? Well,
you're right. There weren't as many. There wasn't the Exponential Conference, and in church planting is almost like an industry now. But my dad, my mom and dad, when I was 4, my brother John was 2, they moved from rural Missouri to Chicago to plant a church. So it was kind of in the backdrop of growing up the whole time.
Yeah. So, church planting, obviously it's almost all on your shoulders as you get it going. Could you take us back to some of the times in your early leadership when you didn't know what to do? Give us an example of something that you didn't know what to do, and then how did you figure it out?
I didn't know what to do and how to figure it out. Well, I mean, the whole idea of starting a church from scratch, I mean, I don't think I really had any idea. I think one of the things that I've consistently tried to do is be someone who finds people who have, more insight, more wisdom, more experience than I do, and do whatever it takes to get close to those people and then ask them questions, write down the answers, and then try to implement whatever I can. I mean, back in the day, when we were first getting ready to start Community Christian, I remember, do you know this name, Carl George?
Yeah.
Okay, so Carl George had just come back from being in Seoul, South Korea, where he'd studied the largest churches in that part of the world, really in the history of Christianity. And he had developed what he called his meta-church model, which later on he wrote a book called, oh gosh, what was the name of that book? It escapes me right now. Oh, Prepare Your Church for the Future. That was it. Prepare Your Church for the Future. And he hadn't come out with that yet, but he started doing these like meta church cluster consultations, which to your listeners won't mean anything. But basically what it was he'd studied the largest church in the history of Christianity and said, okay, how could we actually do that in the Western world? And I hadn't even planted the church yet, but I had heard that he was starting to do these. And so I just began to bombard him with letters and bug him to let me come to his meta church cluster consultation. And he and he refused. And part of the reason, he said, no, you can't come. He said, one, your church isn't big enough. And two, you don't even have a church. But I was kind of persistent. I, well, like what, basically what would it take for me to get in the room? And finally he got back to me and he said, I'll tell you what, you can come if you sit on the observer's bench. Which I didn't even know what that meant, but I knew I had to do it. So I was like, okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
And so I went to Cincinnati. I was living in Chicago and was there for a couple different days. There were some of the larger churches in the country that were there. He was teaching them. I sat in the side of the room, but sitting next to me, I don't know if this name means anything to you. Do you remember the name Eddie Gibbs?
Yeah, sure. From Fuller Seminary, I think.
Exactly. So, and he had been kind of the church growth guru from Europe, but he'd come to Fuller and he'd never heard Carl present his latest content. And so he showed up and it turned out he sat right next to me. And so for the next like 2 or 3 days, as Carl's presenting, okay, here's how you take, kind of what God has done in an extraordinary way in Korea, and here's how we could make it happen and work in the West. I was taking it all in, feverishly taking notes, but I also, by God's grace, I had Eddie Gibbs right next to me, basically talking to me, explaining to me, like coaching me through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we ended up doing at Community, a lot of what John and I wrote in our first book, Exponential, and a lot of what we've ended up doing through NewThing really came out of that. But part of it was, I go back to your original question, is I mean, when I'm around the right people and there's people that I know I can gain from, I will always try to show up with a list of questions and take notes and then go, okay, how do I begin to apply this? So that's been super helpful to me.
Yeah,
it's simple, but it's helpful.
I know it's always struck me when I'm with an older leader, someone who's got more experience than I do, and we're in some setting and they get a notebook out and start writing things down. That's always convicting to me. I'm like, man, these people never stop learning.
Oh, I remember one time I was in St. Louis, and a guy who I'd actually done an internship at his church back in the day in California, a guy named Ben Merrill, and Ben had a very, very large church, but they'd invited me into that city to talk about multi-site. And it was when multi-site was just a brand new thing. And I remember Ben walking in the room. This is the guy I did an internship under.
Yeah.
He's like sitting there with his pad of paper, taking notes on, multi-site. And it was the same kind of thing. And you're going like, okay, if he can do this, yeah, we can all do this.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're 3 decades in and, obviously Community and NewThing Network and Exponential, just some of these organizations you built. Tell us today, like 2019, 2020, what's a leadership situation today where you don't exactly know what to do?
A leadership situation today where I don't know exactly what to do. Good question. Let me think. I think, okay, here's one thing. I mean, I just came out of a lead team retreat with my leadership team here at Community. And we finished reading, Mark DeBoz has a new book that just came out called The Coming Church Economic Revolution or something like that. And basically he makes a case that every church needs to think of, you have a revenue stream of people who give contributions, but then you also need to think in terms of multiple revenue streams and really how do you begin to think of business as mission? And I feel like, this is why I talked to my lead team, I said, I think we're stuck a little bit in a paradigm that we think the only resources, financial resources we have available to us are whatever people give, on Sunday or online as a part of our kind of quote unquote offering. How do we begin to not only think about that, but also, break outside that paradigm and think about, the church operating with multiple revenue streams. And as we began to explore it, we're going hey, we do this event, we do this conference, we have these resources, we have this many facilities. And so I feel like I'm at a point right now, I don't really know how to do it. But, I'm reading DeMaz's book, there's other people I'm talking to, and we're going to figure it out. How do you, really expand your resource? You can advance the mission in an even greater way by having multiple revenue streams.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I asked the question because I think a lot of young leaders presume that they're going to grow out of not knowing what to do. But my take is that most leaders I respect, they just have learned to live with a gap between knowing what to do and having to do something and then figuring out, how to get through it.
I think that's wise. And here's the other thing I would say too. This is another reason, and I can come up with lots of why you need to be involved in church planning. Because after you've been doing this for a while, I think we have, we do get kind of stuck in our own paradigm, but there's nothing like being around a church planter who's having to start all over, start from scratch. I mean, that's where the breakthroughs happen. That's where innovation happens on the edges. And by being involved in church planting or being involved in a church planter's life, you get close to those people. And those, I think it's just a wealth of learning for pastors in established churches. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it keeps you young. Yeah. At our church, we have college interns, and it's the same idea. We're all getting old, and we need some young people who don't know any better to come and shake us up a bit. I think it's brilliant. Yeah. So, you're a pretty veteran entrepreneurial leader now, Dave. As you look across the leadership landscape, whether it's in church or just Christian leaders in nonprofits, what mistake or mistakes do you see entrepreneurial leaders making the most?
Entrepreneurial leaders. I mean, a few things come to mind. I don't know if this would be so much a mistake as I think one of the struggles is we encourage them to dream big, but when the dream doesn't match reality, it's kind of like, what do you do then? And that, in fact, we did some research through Exponential, and that's the biggest challenge for church planters is everybody, my church is going to be the church, we're going to grow to, 500 in the first year, and it's going to be 1,000 in 3 years. And then, you're in it and you're just barely making budget after, 3 years, and you got 100 folks, and and while that might be actually really a great start, it doesn't match the dream. I don't know if that's so much a mistake, but that's a struggle. I think maybe more mistakes when you think about entrepreneurial leaders. Maybe I think because they're wired, whatever they're trying to starting too soon, not figuring out what your checklist is, or working alongside someone else, especially if it's in church planning, who's an organization who's already done this 100 times, and you don't have to go through the brain damage that they went through. So, and then you skip a couple steps of launching too soon. There's of course the classic mistakes of in a business or a church startup of being underfunded. And I think some of those things I did, or actually too, not having enough leaders or no plan for leadership development. Those are the two things you have to keep advancing the mission. Being led, we all had three things: led by the Spirit, but then as the Spirit leads you, how do you have the resources to make it happen, and how do you have the people and the leadership people to make it happen? So if you're underfunded or under-resourced with leaders, or at least a plan for developing leaders, that's also fatal.
I think, Dave, that might be one of your unique contributions. Like all the church that you've helped build and the organizations you've started, they all seem to have a robust infrastructure. Like they all seem to certainly be able to survive without you driving it. I wonder if that is the key missing piece for a young leader. Like I think when we're young, we have so much vision. we get too excited by our own vision and we don't put enough time into the nuts and bolts. Is that what you're suggesting?
I guess, yeah. I mean, maybe in some ways, yeah. And because I think if you're not investing at the smallest level, you're never going to be able to see the big dream happens. And I think, so for me, like, let's talk about church. If I'm not doing the work of being in a small group, having a small group apprentice leader, but then also making sure that's happening across the whole organization, then the big dream of wherever you're trying to take this thing is never going to happen. I mean, like right now, even so, 30 years into it, one of our key objectives, and it has been for the last couple of years, and we usually have 3 to 5 what we call KOs, key objectives, that we're working at every location and church-wide we're going after, is our number of apprentice leaders. And so we are tracking how many apprentice leaders do we have at each location, how many do we have in different ministries, how many do we have church-wide, and what are we doing to actually grow that? So, yeah, I mean, and part of it for me was, maybe it was also a mindset. I didn't really assume that people were just going to show up to hear me talk, because I'm not that interesting. But if I could develop enough leaders who would develop enough groups, and good stuff, and that's where I think the best stuff does happen, was happening in the life of those small groups. The infrastructure there, people would show up because that's where their friendships were. That's where spiritual maturation was happening. Then we could really do something together.
Yeah, you're starting to introduce, a lot of the concepts you wrote about in Hero Maker. In our church, we were a church plant. We were able to move into our own building 6 years ago, and we struggled for the first decade or so of being portable. And so our solution to the staffing problem was to recruit people from within the church rather than anyone we're training outside of our church. And here's what's been wild, Dave. We took our staff through Hero Maker last year. Right after it came out, we grabbed it, we went through it as a staff, and now we're actually really intentional about implementing it as a staff. I have been surprised at my excellent staff who are amazing leaders and their reticence to tap someone else on the shoulder and make them an apprentice leader. Yeah. That's not across the board. Not all my staff is that way. But this is a resistance that we've fought as we've brought Hero Maker in, because that's a big value of yours, is measuring your leadership pipeline. You give us all these tools to do it. Have you run into this problem in other churches that you've seen doing Hero Maker work?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Why is that? Yeah. What's the resistance?
I think the little bit of the resistance is, if I train someone else to do my job, what will I do? And I'm not sure it's always at the forefront of our mind, but I think there is kind of probably some of the things we even started to talk a little bit before we got on here. There's this need to be needed, and when I do this thing and I do it pretty good, then I get affirmed, and so there's probably either knowingly or maybe even unknowingly, unconsciously, this resistance going like, if I train someone to do what I'm doing, then what will I do? And I won't be needed anymore. And so we actually, even in Hero Maker, and I'm not sure this is exactly works for everybody, but I think it does for a lot of leaders, we challenge them before you ever get to that first practice of multiplication thinking, is you need to have a really big dream. And this dream that you have has to be bigger than you. And then we even challenge people, if you don't have a dream that's dependent on God, then you need to get a bigger dream. Because what happens when we have, I think, God-sized dreams is it forces us outside of ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, do we have time for a quick story?
Oh, yeah, man. Yep.
You know Neil Cole?
Yeah.
I remember this is way back in the day. I remember I was sitting in a workshop with Neil, and he was the guy who, in the workshop, he said, okay, I want you to think about your current dream for your church. And so I'm thinking to myself, oh man, if I had a church of 1,000 people, right? If I had a church of 1,000 people, my church, that's how I was thinking. Yeah. That would be something. And so then Neil says, well, I want you to take your current dream and multiply it times 1 million. And so I was like, okay, 1,000 times 1 million, that's 1 billion. And then he says this, now I want you to figure out, how could you do that?
Yeah.
And what was so great about that exercise is like 1,000 people, and I'm going like, for some people go like, oh, I could speak good enough. I could hold the attention of 1,000 people. Maybe for me, it was going like, well, I bet I could develop enough leaders, to create an organization of 1,000 people. But then when he said a billion, you get to a billion people. I mean, I knew I couldn't do that on my own. I couldn't speak that well. I couldn't organize that well. And what it did is that began to force me outside of myself, which I think in some ways gave birth to a lot of things we got to do at community, or even, NewThing, which, we have 170 some networks around the world now. And I think that's even at a staff level. And I kind of, in the book, we actually bring it down to 100. So take your current dream and multiply it times 100. If you're a student ministry leader, think about the dream that you have, multiply it times 100. Now figure out how would you do that. And as you figure out how to do that, it forces you outside yourself. And as it forces you outside yourself, I think it also then forces you to begin to think, okay, I got to develop other people and invest in other people and those things.
Yeah, we did that. I think in the book you call it the napkin exercise. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah, the dream napkin. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, we did that as a staff, and it was a fascinating experience. And I think for me, David, it was an indictment on my leadership, because I think when you recruit staff from within your congregation, the win is you get all this incredible culture built into your staff. We have not really had to enculturate our staff because they've been a part of our church, but helping our staff see the kingdom of God beyond our church, that's been the challenge, where God's at work all over the world in these incredible ways. But if all they've ever known is our church, it does tend to shrink your thinking, I think.
Yeah.
Here's the challenge we ran into. I think some people were afraid of maybe being worked out of a job, but the bigger resistance we faced is people felt it was discourteous to bother somebody else to get them into ministry, even though they loved that we bothered them. They loved that we tapped them on the shoulder and said, here's what I see in you. That's another one of the things you mentioned is the I see in you conversation. Here's what I see in you. Come and see me. Let's now you do it. But they then didn't want to tap someone else on the shoulder. And what they were claiming was it was a courtesy issue. And that was people were more resistant than I expected. Have you run into that as well?
Yeah, I think there is some of that. Yeah, we don't want to bother people. I do think that I think what you talked about too, reflect on the fulfillment, the joy that it brings you when you get to really feel like God's used you to make a difference in the life of someone else. And I do think you have to, you go back to like in Ephesians 2:10 that, there's a good work that God prepared in the life of everyone to do, right?
Yeah.
And you have to remind people that, hey, no, that those people that you're serving, there's something really important God meant for them to do.
Yeah.
And you are not serving them well if you're not challenging them to fulfill that. And I think that longing for purpose and calling that's innate in all of us. I think you just have to keep reminding your staff team and your people going like, no. You're actually doing them a favor. You are serving them well when you give them the opportunity to serve like you are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's what we've been trying to say to them is like, you're hoarding all the good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can tell that you've been putting off the inevitable, but unfortunately, Dave, it is time that we move into our gauntlet of anxiety questions that I ask of every guest.
All right, let's bring it on.
Yeah, let's do this. All right. So between a spinning mind or a racing heart or a tightening gut, where in your life would you first notice chronic anxiety?
I think it would be spinning mind.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Okay. So I mean, I felt like it was, cause you sent me some of these questions ahead of time. So I was going like, it's kind of like a self-assessment, and most people like assessments because no thing's more interesting than me.
Right.
And I was kind of like, nah, tight kneed gut. No, I don't think I really ever have that. A racing heart, rarely. I think it's more of a spinning mind, and the spinning mind would be, I think, kind of like, if like, and this doesn't happen very often either, but like if you can't sleep at night because you keep thinking about something,
yes,
or
that's it.
Mind, that's what it'd be like for me. I think that's the one.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And then I think based on our wiring and personality and all kinds of things, we all have different leadership situations that generate anxiety in our life. Like it's the same situation. Are you able to name one or two situations even today where you know that it's either going to make you anxious or you're going to go into it anxious?
See, I don't know. You can tell me if this is what you're looking for, if this is right or not. Two things came to mind. One is like a financial pinch in an organization. And I don't know if that's really exactly what you're talking about, but I certainly hate it.
Yep.
It always feels like a distraction. It feels like a distraction because it's kind of like because I think I am, like you've said, more entrepreneurial and forward thinking and kind of like to be visionary. It feels like, oh my gosh, now I feel like I'm digging out of a hole instead of going somewhere. So that makes me crazy.
Yeah. Let's before we get to the next one, Dave, let's chase the financial one. Usually an anxiety is driven by a felt need. So in this case, I'm going to play with some ideas. Maybe maybe the felt need is we can't make forward progress enough. Maybe it's, I feel responsible for people's jobs. Are you able to name what's driving a financial anxiety?
I'm sure that's something to do with success.
Success, yeah.
No, it's too bad it's not more altruistic because I kind of assume everybody can take care of themselves.
Yeah, okay.
No, it probably has to do with, success. Because like even on the Enneagram, like I'm a 3.
Yeah.
And so the 3, you pretty much like to be perceived as successful.
Yeah.
And so I think if there's a financial pinch, no matter what, then that would feel like, okay, you should have anticipated this. You should have done something different. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's good.
Success.
Yeah, that's a good example. Okay, so I cut you off. Is there another one you wanted to share? You don't have to, but if another one comes to mind.
Sure. I mean, the other one that kind of also is relational conflict, I think. So if they're almost, so it could be with my wife or with a staff person. And if there's a conflict, I pretty much want to resolve it right now.
How are you when two people you love are in conflict, but you're not in conflict with them?
How am I?
Yeah.
I would say I probably, I probably try to help them get along and figure it out without being the person who they both end up blaming.
Now that is a skill.
It is a skill. Because, I mean, I'm trying to think. Because I feel like I'm in therapy. There was a season where, like when my daughter was a teenager, where like I could be in the room with her and my wife, and if those two are in a conflict, and I would try to help, right? Inevitably, somehow, this is just my perception. I'm sure they'd have a different take on it, okay? But my perception was that I would end up being the one who would get blamed. Like, oh, why are you taking her side? Or why are you making her ask for forgiveness? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, why did I even bother?
Yeah. In family systems theory, that's known as triangulation, which is when three people are in a relationship that only two people actually need to be in.
Right. So I probably just stayed out.
Yeah. Okay. So related to that, another theory is that chronic anxiety is often contagious in a group. And then the most anxious person in the room often has the most power. So, for example, in a small group, if somebody is always chronically in need and they show up week after week in need, what tends to happen is the whole group puts all their attention on that chronically needy person. In the moment, the person feels really good because they get all this attention, but they almost always go home feeling like shame, like, oh man, I did it again.
What's the it? What'd they do again?
Oh, like they took all the attention from the group. They were the one that shared all their problems every week, and the group maybe never got to the study or something like that.
Yeah.
Where have you seen anxiety be contagious in a group, whether it's a staff or a small group or a family?
I can think of particular families where, it seemed like even the mom or her anxiety would manifest itself in like even sickness.
Yeah.
And like family was chronically having just illness after illness after illness. And there was no way I could prove it, but it just kind of like, what is happening there?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I think leaders reproduce who they are. And so I think that would speak to what you're saying here too. And I have seen, leaders who they're anxious about certain things, and you can just feel it. You can feel it in the room. It's like they are the culture creators. You can feel it in their people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You can walk into a room and feel what's happening regardless of what's being said.
Yes.
Yeah. That's it in a nutshell. Yeah. Dave, you're killing it. The last question, when in your life do you feel most fully loved?
That's a great question. I think genuinely, I would say two things come to mind. One is if I'm on vacation with my family, my immediate family. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm literally, it's funny as you're saying, I'm almost getting a little emotional because I'm thinking about one of the things we've done for probably the last decade or so. We go up to a place called Door County, Wisconsin. And it's a really nice, it's a nice place, but it's kind of there's a rhythm to what we do up there. And it's kind of like, I'm not sure we're gonna be able to get it done this year because of stuff going on in the kids' lives and that kind of stuff. So we may end up just having 4 days over in Michigan and stuff. And that makes me sad.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. But
I love that your answer was people and place. What is it about the place in Wisconsin that gets you going?
I think it's that the people are there, and there's certain things that we all like to do there, and we do together. So my boys are competitive runners. I run, so there's a park that we'll go run together. If they're kind and slow down.
Yeah.
And, we'll go biking together. We do everything together. And so I think it's just, yeah. And so it's kind of an uninterrupted kind of week of just hanging out with the people that I love the most. So I think that's one. The other one that came to mind too was, sorry to give the right answer on this one, but it does feel like when you're in the middle of a real, I'd say corporate worship experience, there's certain there'll be a particular song doesn't really come to mind right now, but there'll be certain, and when you talk about when you feel, it is there, I feel like grace, I feel accepted, I feel like I'm God's child.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You're talking about like a transcendent experience. Yeah.
So I think those are probably the two times I feel most loved.
Yeah, I love that. I do think what's unique for a pastor is I think we tend to conflate our identity as God's child with our role as God's employee. And I think part of what you're getting at is you just get to take that pastor hat off and just be a kid.
Yeah. No, yeah, actually, that hadn't occurred to me. So I don't really, I don't think of it as like I'm there as his employee. No.
Yeah, you don't see yourself as God's employee as a default.
No.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add, Dave, before we wrap up?
No, this was fun.
Awesome. This was fun for me too. I've been a great appreciator of you for several years. I haven't been to Exponential in a long time, but I used to head over to Florida.
Come back.
Yeah, got to come back. Yeah, it's such a great conference. Man, thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate you stepping out a busy day and giving us some thoughts.
No, well, thanks you for having me, and thank you for what you're doing, and I appreciate you having me on.
For more resources, visit stevecusswords.com or missioalliance.org.